Hello, everyone. I can see some familiar faces. The Carnies, hello. And I've got my dear friend here, Wendy Fry, who's also on the list. And everybody else, honestly, I wish I could see you all together in the room. Here's Richard and Helen. Lovely to see you. And I'm sure there's lots more people there that I know from when I first spoke at Gladesville with Mandy in the beginning of the year. Seems so long ago, that beginning of the year. I remember someone saying, oh, you know, back in the good old days, 3 weeks ago. I think we can nearly say 3 months ago now.
Yes, indeed. So, Penny, do we want to launch straight into those? How about we run through what we're going to do today and what we're going to cover, and then we'll introduce the concept of the breakout rooms. So I'll throw up that first slide that outlines what we're doing today.
Slide 4, I think, on that one, Mandy.
Excellent.
Where are we going?
Excellent. Nothing like 3,000,001 buttons to push at the same time. So
there we go.
Here's where we're going. So today we're going to cover all these sorts of topics. So distress tolerance, defining addiction, the cycle of addiction, the who and the why, overcoming addiction, and an introduction to the overcomer's place. So it's a lot to cover. Penny, how are we going to cover all of that?
Speed dating, 40 minutes into it.
Cool. So what we thought that we'd do in terms of the structure of tonight, we're actually going to, at the very beginning now, I'm going to create us into, so normally when we'd walk in, if we were doing this at church, you'd sit down at a table and we'd say, introduce yourself to the people at the table if there's some people that you don't know. And then we'd give you a couple of questions to think about, to get you thinking about the topic that we're going to cover. Now, we're not going to sit at tables, but I can throw you into a breakout room, which is kind of like a table. You can introduce yourself to the people that are sitting around the table and then have a look at the questions that we've got prepared for you. So I'm going to put us into, there'll be 3 or 4 participants in each breakout room, and these are the questions that we're going to cover. I'm going to pull them up first and share the screen so that you can see them. That's that. Let's go share screen. So these are the 4 questions that we'd like you to think about in your breakout groups. Penny, do you want to run us through them?
So that first one is thinking, how do I tolerate distress in my life? What are the strategies that we use to handle that kind of, you know, impact of stress on us? What's our definition of addiction, if we have one? Maybe this one's an easy one. You know, what are the perceptions of an alcoholic, for example, or someone with an addict? It's just that alcohol's just got that one thing. And how will you help those in distress or in addiction?
Okay, what I'm going to do is I will also pop those questions into the chat function so that you can see them in the chat function. And I'm going to just automatically assign people into the breakout rooms. So I don't know which room you're going to, but I'm going to give you a little bit of time in your breakout rooms. Let me just...
Do you want to, is there a time, like 5 minutes, Mandy?
Yep. 5 minutes in the breakout rooms, and then you'll come back.
There are a lot of big questions to answer in 5 minutes, team. I've got 40 minutes to answer them.
Okay, so, and I will give you there'll be a 6-minute timer on your breakout room so that you'll know when time's about up, and then you'll come back to the main room. So is everyone ready to go and introduce yourself to some people? Ready, set, go.
Hello. Do you have to unmute yourself?
Hi, Emily.
Hi.
I'm still on mute.
Was everyone on mute in there?
No, we were
a breakout group.
With ourselves.
We'll
Yeah.
manage that. Let me keep moving all my screens back.
Sorry, Penny.
Now, Mandy's going to put up a photo of my family. A screen of that second slide, Mandy.
Yep, it's coming.
Third one, actually. Now that's interesting. Is it on?
Yep.
Now that's funny. I can't see the shared screen. So I can't see this slide that's up.
Trust me, Penny, it's your family.
But it'll help guide me as I go through, if I can see them is the trick. So guys, this is my family. I am someone who's struggled with addiction, and I bet none of you thought when you talked about your perceptions that this was the sort of image you would have up there. And I hope that this image raises for you those kind of questions of like, well, Penny doesn't look like an alcoholic, or at least I hope you don't think I look like one. And raises those questions of why, how did I overcome it? How did I get into it? How did I get out of it? Well, tonight's plan is to help answer some of those questions. But first off, I want to talk to us about this funny little idea called capacity. And it's funny because initially we go, oh yeah, we all know what capacity is, but I just want to be able to give you a little illustration. I've got a little cup. It's just an ordinary little plastic cup. This represents a certain level of capacity compared to, say, something like a jug. Let me hold the jug back. So I've got this and this and this. It's almost like a primary school science experiment, isn't it? And then I've got this. Let's say this orange ball represents my stresses. If it meets my cup, my certain level of capacity, then there's a certain experience. And we can describe this in a million different ways. But notice what happens with this, all the stress, if I put it in the cup, in the jug, this much bigger capacity, and I get a completely different experience of my relationship with the ball. This idea of capacity and distress tolerance has been coined as a window of tolerance. Now, this is where I really wish we were in the room, because if we were in the room together, I could say, so how many of us have heard of that idea? This window of tolerance is a wonderful term that basically in many ways answers the whole question of how I overcame my addiction. Basically, my capacity increased. Now, here we go. Let me just click some buttons. Yep, there we go. 20 years ago, when I started to read these books that had this information in it about neurobiology, I was like, oh, I needed this information years ago. But unfortunately, 30 years ago, only the top neuroscience actually knew this. Today, they'll be teaching our young kids, as someone in my breakout room said. And as I saw in the news last night, that Woollahra Public School are actually teaching their kids using COVID as an example, because it's in this optimal arousal zone, in that rainbow image. Have we got that one up, Mandy, the rainbow one? That our amazing God has given us. It keeps clicking back. Why is that clicking back for me? Oh, sorry, guys. Here we go, down there. There we go. Now I'm set. Our amazing God has given us the capacity to handle threat when we're endangered and to thrive when we are safe in our nervous systems. In the window, when we're in that optimal arousal zone, we can think and feel and sense all at the same time to determine what's safe and what isn't, because our executive brain, that thinking consequential brain, works with our automatic nervous system. We can take in the information from our environment, from connecting with others, to determine what's safe and what's not. We've actually got the capacity in this zone to learn and to listen. We're in that rainbow space. However, if we are out of that window, that optimal arousal, and this zone is different for every different person and different situation, we will feel shut down, or we might feel enraged. We lose our executive function and our automatic nervous system takes over. I'm sure we've all had experiences like this, some of us more than others. Our capacity for regulation depends on the width of that window. When our stresses exceed our capacity, we feel threatened. Our automatic nervous system is designed to take us out of our window and use the energy to survive. It removes energy from the systems in our body that help us thrive. Oh, hang on, every time that help us survive. Oh, now my computer's doing something. Here it is.
Sorry. Oh, I won't share.
Or just roll the slides up, Mandy, because then they can see me in the corner, surely. So it should, yeah. So our system will shut down these systems of digestion, immunology, and inflammation systems and moves that energy over to the survival systems, the things like flight, fight, freeze. These take a lot of energy, these threatening states. And so the body is designed to do this perfectly. We are either in survival, safety. We are in thriving, or we're in threat. It's a bit like COVID at the moment. We're in a warfare situation, almost rationing our going out, rationing our resources in order to sustain our well-being and our health. This is something to remember as we talk about addiction later, because this is where our addictive wiring is perpetuated. I'm hoping you're all in your windows tonight. So as you're listening to me, even with the screens going back and forward, even on this less familiar platform than being all together, our brains have got to work that little bit harder. But it's on these edges where our brain is most plastic. It's where we can take in and learn new information. So let's take a moment to notice ourselves. Are we feeling in the middle of our zone and quite comfortable and chilled? Or are we up near the edge and excited to learn something new? Or has something already feel threatening to you, like my screen doing that change, that can take you out of the window? Here we go, overcome with new. As we take a moment in the present to re-regulate, we can start by asking ourselves, what do we notice? Are we aware of our breath? Is my heart beating fast? I think my heart's beating faster than most of yours. Can we feel our feet on the ground? Do we notice the seat we're sitting on or the chair? A little wriggle, a little sigh can reset us back in that window. It can be as simple as a mantra going breath out, ground, spine. These little techniques can help any of us stay in our window once we notice we're out. Noticing is the key. I wonder what techniques you will take home from tonight, because it's in the window that we have the capacity to bounce back, the way Lynn talked about with us in April. In our windows, we can regulate our emotions, we can access our resources that are around us to build the safety we need to thrive. And we're able then to remain resilient in the face of distress, because our capacity is built. I'm wondering if you've been discovering and building those 3 donut resilient resources that Lynn talked about in April with us. COVID has been a perfect season to practice these, because practicing those kind of resourcing skills will help grow our window. And this is key to overcoming any addiction, as we'll see tonight. It's in this window that we can notice our tracking is more, say, we're going to the next slide, Mandy. When we are outside this window, we notice we notice that we feel triggered, and we then take action to use these resources and become regulated. Our experiences will vary every day. For example, now if we were all together tonight, maybe some of us would have driven. Someone might have cut somebody off in the lane. You get a fright. You go, whoa, what was that? You notice, you move your car out of the way, no accident occurs, and you reset and come back in that line, even if you might have been out momentarily. There are some days you can drive along and cheerfully let everybody in, and generally the traffic conditions are not going to take you out of your window, because you're in the jug, you've got plenty of capacity. And then there are those days with the cup. Everything around you seems to be hard. Maybe you are operating with less of your resilient donut resources. And that same driving experience has a very different impact on you. It's taken you out of your window. Maybe the horn beep threatened you. The actions that result may be more like a panic. These reactions are essentially determined by the size of this window of tolerance. We might experience either a minor agitation or a complete road rage incident, because inside that window is where an individual can receive, can process, and integrate information so that any minor agitation in the traffic can be assessed and we take action to reduce the threat. We can move out of the threat and back to safer driving conditions. And our automatic nervous system's response is deactivated from threat back to safety until the next stressor comes along. And sometimes life keeps throwing stress triggers at us. Our threat response continues to be activated. Our bodies experience life as more on the side of warfare than welfare. When our survival wiring remains switched on, we lack the capacity or resources to re-regulate and returning to that optimal zone. We lack that resilience to bounce back. The more we remain outside our window, the more the body will see everything coming at it as a threat. And we lose that capacity to listen and learn and connect safely with others. Why does this happen? Because the more that wires together, the more fires together in the brain. So our threat wiring gets wired up and not our safety wiring. Primarily, this is what I do as a counsellor, is I help clients who come along distressed build their capacity, build this biology, this capacity for safety wiring so they can feel safe with another human being. Trauma and addiction are threatening, not just to our brains, but to our bodies. They wire up our brains to remain outside the window. So life begins to feel a lot more like we're in a cup than we're in a jug. And the presence of a safe, responsive other helps build a client's capacity for regulation, resources, and resiliency. However, I'm going to move up a couple of slides, Mandy. However, I love this image of the knitting in the brain, making sense of what's coming out of one's brain, where it feels all messy and foggy, and then creating this lovely kind of, oh, that all makes sense. I was out of my window, I felt threatened, and now I'm back in it. Up to the next one. I help clients who've been impacted by this trauma and addiction to rebuild and expand their wiring, their windows, so that they have the capacity to tolerate distress without using the old pathways that have become associated with substance abuse. So if we follow that red line, it gets very clunky, going bang, bang, bang. If we associate that difficult way of being with a substance, that's where the addictive wiring is. Overcoming addiction is about retraining that brain away from the survival wiring outside of the window on the red track and back into the black track, where we can notice agitations, take action, and come back into safety. It's no easy task if your brain's been rewired to that powerful surviving wiring, because it's a bit like if you've ever played 500, which my kids love, it's like having a trump card. Our survival wiring always trumps our safety wiring because it's more important that we're alive than we're safe in terms of that Maslow hierarchy of needs. For example, how many of us will take a quick coffee instead of a 20-minute lie down, just looking for quick relief when we're tired? And our whole culture is addicted to quick fixes. And our brains then become designed for in a powerful preemptive way. Our brains work efficiently because they preempt our next move. So the more we use any quick fix, the more the brain assumes that we will access them first. For example, how many of us have driven a manual car and then got into an automatic one and had the left leg lift? That's an example of preemptive brain or predictive brain patterning. You've been on a freeway, for example, let's say when you way home, and you always take one exit, but someone from home has rung and said, can you pick something up? And the next thing you know, you've gone past the exit where you needed to exit before the home one to get that. And then, but the brain preempted that you would. And it's the same with addiction here.
But Penny, how does that, so this is all really, really helpful stuff about how our brain works, but how does that relate to addiction?
Because when these individuals any individual uses a quick fix to get themselves back in the window, that quick fix can overreach the mark. So instead of pulling up before we hit that bottom wall, we go past it. We slide from one side of our window to the other. Going back to our rainbow, we kind of slide from the freezing back to the blowing up, or, from the chaos of a blow up back to rigidity, I won't say anything. And often this is what happens with diagnosis of anxiety and depression. We're either completely anxious going out, or we completely shut down in our depression. The track on this red line feels sharp. It feels rigid and stuck like that little cup, as opposed to the more flexible option with the bigger capacity of a window. And the more we're outside, the smaller our windows get, because our brains predict, and our wiring, what wires together fires together. Now, the neurobiology behind all of this is essentially why addiction is referred to as a brain disease. The addicted brain begins to track along that red line. We are designed to move up and down within this space, like the black one, but once we've hooked up with a substance, it keeps us tracking on that red line. And the black one almost becomes unavailable. It is very complicated brain stuff, I know, and it's why finding a term to describe addiction can be a complicated process. What the American Society of Addiction Medicine, though, have come up with is this one. Addiction is defined as a primary chronic disease, and these are the aspects of the brain it impacts: the brain's reward system, the brain's motivation system, the brain's memory system, and all the related circuitry. So therefore, are we not surprised at the second part of the definition, where the dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological stuff that happens in the body, the craving and the predictive brain stuff, psychological, meaning the association with the substance and stress, and socially, because our culture is so engaged in quick fixes, and spiritually, spiritual manifestations. Basically, the addicted brain pathways believe that the substance or behaviour that originally gave them temporary relief is bringing them safety when the body is actually going into threat. Effectively, the brain swaps that black line for the red one. And this altered brain functioning leads to altered thinking. It confuses within the body the feeling of safe and threat. The problems will pile up as the substances continue to be used. The window of tolerance is reduced, and a person loses their access to feeling safe in their own body. This is why it becomes an incredibly complex condition to resolve. Yet those who live with someone who's addicted, they know the experience of living with someone with all this multiplicity of manifestations caused by this dysfunctional circuitry. So if we go up to that lovely cartoon, Mandy, this is really what I found so helpful in summing up what the addictive patterning is. It was drawn for me when I began Overcomers Outreach some 15 years ago. The wires in the poor little fellow lying down have become confused between safety and survival. The addict believes they must have the substance to feel safe in the face of the threat. But the reality is that the substance is creating more threat for them. And all the dear family and friends look at something like this cartoon. See, I hope you can see the little sign in there on the big bossy fellow with addiction. They can see that the addiction, the monster of addiction and its consequences have got the addict beaten. But the addict continues to believe the substance is bringing relief to their distress. They have to falsely believe they can beat the monster because they believe life without the substance will be even more distressing. There's a gap, a big disconnection with reality. And often it's in this denial that perpetuates the addict. The denial is what the health authorities so eloquently call a dysfunction in our circuitry. There's a gap between what one believes is happening and what the reality actually is. Mind the gap, we hear. because it's in this gap where relapsing occurs again and again, which further perpetuates the reduction of the window, which further uses the pathways, etc., etc. So if we look at the cycle of distress, it's why it's so important to ask ourselves, how am I tolerating distress in my life? Am I using a helpful resource that builds my window of tolerance? Or am I using an unhelpful resource, like drugs and alcohol, like a whole range of things that will reduce it? So if we go back to our car driving scenario, by moving my car out of the way of that oncoming vehicle, I get to return my nervous system back to safety. I might feel a little shaky after a close call, and I might have to slow down and reduce the threat of other cars coming at me. But effectively, I've returned to my window of tolerance. Alternatively, if I don't have the capacity to make that wise decision, in other words, if I'm not in my window of tolerance, I'll automatically feel threatened. I might get out of the car, I might attack the other guy, I might press my horn, which really puts my life more in a threatening situation. If the other person feels threatened and then gets out of their car and starts to attack me, I'm completely out of my window. And this behaviour of, I mean, I put in here drug of choice, but and I'm using the car analogy, but it's anything that I think brings me temporary relief, but in reality has negative consequences, because it's this distress relief pathway, once it's wired up with the substance, because it's associated with my survival, which is where addiction lives. It's in this region that we actually don't have, it's when we're out of our window in this region that we don't have access to that executive consequential thinking that can let me make those necessary wise decisions to stay safe. So if we put this cycle in a funnel, something like this, if I had in the thing, I think I've got a picture of a funnel coming up. Oh yeah, here we go. Because this can all get very technical and brainy, and it is incredibly complicated in the brain. If we put it in a funnel, basically what happens is every time I do a round, I take a spin in that funnel on that cycle of using a substance or an unhelpful behaviour to overcome my distress. I get less ability to function. And so the funnel goes further and further down. It's more, the more we use that drug of choice, the more the pain we perpetuate in our cycle, because the negative consequences pile up. It was this cycle I was on with alcohol. Part of my brain thought it was helping, and another part knew that it wasn't. But the two weren't connected when I'm out of my window. The more I was out of my window, the more I operate on autopilot with the automatic nervous system, the more the cycle takes me down that funnel. AA coined this reality as admitting powerlessness, actually surrendering to the reality that that's what was happening. Because the question to keep asking ourselves is, if I relieve my distress with something that continues to take me out of my window, I will reduce the size of my window and my size to cope with any more distress. I'm literally reversing my illustration from the jug back to the cup, because it's in this vulnerable space of survival wiring where addictive patterns fester. What may have helped us feel safe initially is outweighed by that negative consequence, and it perpetuates that threat wiring even further, putting that vicious cycle down, going downwards and downwards and downwards, and often outside of my conscious awareness, because I'm not in my window and I'm not noticing what's really happening. So if we continue to treat that pain of our distress with some kind of substance, the pattern then goes, the two go hand in hand together, and the brain pathway preempts that we continue to use that substance. So let's pause for a moment and consider that first discussion question of what strategies are we using? In my breakout room, the one person we heard had some really good ideas and strategies around what she was using. But we have to keep asking ourselves, in this fallen world, what am I avoiding? What am I trying? Am I trying to overcome my depressive feelings By using something like alcohol, it's actually a depressant and it's going to make me feel worse. Or am I numbing out some of my experiences with food binges or Netflix or pornography, rather than something like healthy diet and exercise that'll give me energy? Am I managing my anxious thinking with drugs, with taking marijuana, which is a really popular one I see? Are we dealing with these struggles and these stresses and sorrows with unhelpful behaviours and therefore enhancing them in my threat capacity and not in my safety capacity? Because the more I do so, the more powerless I will become. It's like experiencing a Groundhog Day movie every day. It just perpetuated more and more troublesome things. Every time we say we'll have a limit around something and we go beyond it, we may feel that we've done one of those rounds in the funnel. When was the last time where any of us struggled to stop a behaviour that others could see was causing us more pain than the temporary relief it was promising? Change is something that is really difficult for the brain because of that preemptive practice. It's one of the reasons I found I was unable to stop using alcohol to relieve distress. Because my brain was on autopilot, I effectively was powerless. And without help, it's too much. So thankfully in 2003, someone took me to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It was there that I found other like-minded individuals who had previously used alcohol for relief, but the reality was that in each time it felt like doing another round in the funnel, and the negative consequences got worse. They described these negative consequences when they talked about what it was like. These wonderful souls helped me identify that reality of doing the same thing and expecting a different result. They demonstrated also the hope that there was evidence that they could overcome. They shared their experience, strength, and hope, and they talked about, as in this guy, this little pup on the left, what it was like with this dear puppy with his booze and his bucket repeating the same thing. They shared their experiences of reaching out for help and how something miraculous occurred where a higher power, a God of their understanding, intervened in their life and they stopped their cycle for 24 hours a day where they gained abstinence. They talked about that moment powerfully, that moment of change, of asking for help, even while their entire body said, no, I'm fine, I can beat the monster. They got out of that crazy ride on the funnel. And at every meeting, they share the resources they use to stay abstinent. Essentially, they talk about a higher power, God, that operates in their lives so they can effectively function without a substance. And they introduce others to a newer and bigger window of tolerance, a jug way of living, not that small cup. They talk about what it's like now. And this brings enormous hope to every newcomer. Within this conversation, there's no judgment, no shame, and no expectation that anyone can just stop without help. There's an understanding of the powerlessness of the preemptive, powerful brain that preempts the next move. And they understand what it feels like to be operating continuously outside that window. These groups create safe connections that go beyond the shame of addiction. And these connections build those bigger windows. Once the powerless person is able to thrive and connect and function again, they have that window. They've got some recovery. And I've got a slide here of these R's that we can hopefully take away and remember tonight. Those without an ability to connect and build their window will relapse. Anytime someone is out of their window of tolerance, that autopilot wiring kicks back in. Building our windows against this powerful pull of the old preemptive patterns requires access to experienced and skilled resources. I was able to access a lot of these resources in my early recovery. Back in 2003, my kids were all safely in primary school during the day, and I could attend meetings, various counselling appointments, various doctor's appointments. I was able to get the resources and the care that was necessary to recover. And I had a husband who could afford this for me to go and do this. Additionally, I had a wonderful Christian community that pointed me to God as my ultimate resource and the ultimate higher power. I knew the truth of Jesus Christ dying for me, and there were many days where I hung on to this as a desperate resource. His promise that nothing could separate me from his love in these moments of change was absolutely essential for me to help build my regulation. That constant reminder that came with the 12-step meetings kept pointing me back again and again and again and towards taking responsibility for my recovery. Every day sober was another day of overcoming, and another day I built that beautiful resilience Lynn talked about. AA is a fellowship that only deals with one substance though. And in recovery, I have found there are many things that these addictive pathways can use when I'm out of my window and dysregulated. One of them at one stage was strawberries. I wonder if you've got something favourite that you do continually out of your window. But the key take home tonight is that if you are in your window of tolerance, you can handle almost anything that life throws at you. You have the capacity to remain regulated and stay away from addictive substances. You can be conscious of these consequences and therefore make those wise decisions. You've got the resources that you can make a conscious decision to use to maintain your resilience in life. And generally, you won't have addictive issues. You know that if you go up out of your window, you know how to get back in it without causing more harm. If you're in a healthy relationship with the substance or behaviour, then by all means, go ahead and use it, whether it's alcohol, whether it's any kind of thing. It's not about the substance where addiction gets wired up. It's about what it gets associated with, stress or safety. And that's why if you have a relationship with a substance that is associated with stress, you'll be outside your window and that'll lead to some addiction problems. Some of you might be at the top of this peak and you might notice that. But as the stress of life increases from time to time, that addiction will take over and you'll slide down the right-hand side of this bell curve. Somewhere along this line is where the substance abuse becomes substance dependence. And when I give these talks, we'll see in the questions, there's lots of questions about where is that line. And the reality is it's kind of different for different individuals, depending on the size of that window. But if we go back to our example of alcohol, guidelines can be helpful. And this is by far the most common drug, alcohol. In fact, in the time we've been giving this talk, sadly, one person in Australia will die from an alcohol-related illness. Can you imagine that? It's a sobering reality that alcohol misuse is in the top 3 preventable causes of early death in Australia. It's this research that's behind the health authority's suggestion of limiting to no more than 2 standard drinks a day and 2 abstinent days a week away from that substance, because this lets the brain examine other strategies. These authorities also define that any more than 4 standard drinks on any one occasion is a binge. Any more than 4 does damage to the health. Something like 30% of those deaths a year are related to cancer. But if we go back to our bell curve and go back to our, let's say, a green traffic light idea, those drinking within these recommendations are kind of on the left-hand side. They're not going to have addiction problems because they're not tying it up enough with their stresses. But if they continue to tie it up with their stresses, it's a bit like going to an amber light. And we're up that top of that peak where there's abuse. And we can say, okay, we're misusing it. We're using it to relieve us from our stress rather than something else that's going to helpfully get us back in our window. And if we keep doing that, abuse will become dependence. We all know what happens if we keep running a red light. The consequences of addiction will pile up, will slide further down that funnel, and effectively we'll be only able to operate outside our window because we've not built the wiring or the capacity to tolerate the stress inside our window. It's why the research reveals that only 3% of those who are really struggling with addiction are actually found in the park. This was an extraordinary statistic when I discovered this. Where are the 97%? The rest of the addicts are functioning in our communities, but functioning at less capacity outside of their window. They will eventually run enough red lights, and hopefully someone will identify addiction as a root cause long before they get to the park. So I wonder what perceptions of addicts you had that second question tonight, because Perceptions can distort the reality. In fact, denial and perceptions are a bit like twins when it comes to addiction. Confused perceptions disable our capacity to recognise who's actually suffering. That is, where are those 97% operating, either in a funnel of addiction or outside their window or whatever language from tonight we want to put on it. But in this Digging Deeper series, our goal was to be more equipped to care for others. So we need to be able to recognise who's struggling. One of the tricks with addiction's progressive nature, though, is that it can be very hard to identify. It's kind of like pregnancy. I was told in the beginning I couldn't be a little bit pregnant. So whether I was 1 month pregnant, that is, a little bit addict, a little bit Amber Light, which I certainly felt like when I got to AA and heard some of the horrible, disastrous stories, I thought, oh, my problem's not that big. But what was I going to do? Wait till I was 9 months? The underlying condition was the same. The circuitry in my brain had been altered. And once someone has slid through that amber light, they will be experiencing the consequences of a red light. They will be living outside their capacity for distress. Could you have recognised that family of mine as struggling with addiction if I came to church? I'm so grateful to Christchurch's willingness to have this topic of addiction on the agenda because there's so much shame about it. When I first started talking, I used to feel the shame around this. But my own journey began when I came to church. I asked for help. I found Christ, or rather he found me. But get this, he found me in 1999. I heard the gospel, I got saved, and then my alcoholism really took off. We were an ordinary church-going family. No one in my social circles identified my alcoholism. When I eventually went to my GP in 2002, he said, no, you're not struggling. He knew our family. No one knew the pain of this image, yet this photo was taken at the height of my alcoholic behaviour. Addiction is a disease, a brain disease, and anyone can be affected, just like anyone can be affected with diabetes or MS or asthma. Yes, there's a whole bunch of reasons why those things happen. There's also a vulnerability in the genetics DNA system that lets people fall into those vulnerable states given no capacity and plenty of stress. And the World Health Organization listed this idea of this brain pathway way back in the 50s. But the shame for many in our communities, including our churches, has largely failed to recognise addiction as a brain disease. And it makes finding effective treatment in or outside a Christian context really difficult. In 2003, my journey began when someone took me to AA. It was a very tiny beginning, but it allowed me to access understanding others. However, we know it was a difficult time for our whole family, but we knew that there was a God who was always going to use this for good. And I found through my entire journey with God that his promises have never, never, never failed. So in 2005, as I started to talk to others about what my experience had been back in 2003 in trying to get sober in a church, it was agreed with some others that we'd set up a ministry for others to come forward and speak. This ministry was called Overcomers Outreach. It's a support group that adapts the 12 steps of AA back to the Bible, where these 12 steps originated back in the 1930s. But the demand became overwhelming. To be honest, most people came. They just wanted a quick answer. And sadly, there are no quick or easy answers to overcoming addiction. It's great news that overcoming brain rewiring, brain plasticity is indeed possible. And with God, a miraculous God, he makes it, I was going to say easy. It's not easy, but he certainly gives an anchor to that real hope in my heart. Because today, after 17 years of practicing, my brain has largely been rewired away from addictive behaviours. I need to maintain continual abstinence to ensure the old patterns are not reawakened. But mostly, I have the capacity to stay in my window. I know I'm sitting on the seat. I've got my feet on the ground. I can choose to breathe. I can choose to notice if I feel threatened or if I feel safe. And when life pushes me out, I've got those resources to get me back into that regulation and resiliency. Addiction is a condition that impacts the mind, the body, and the spirit. And most of those who come to OO need support across more support than just this simple spiritual model. I met many along the way that do not have access to the resources. And that is why I've retrained, went back to uni of all things, and studied and continued to build opportunities for others to overcome the shame of a continually relapsing addictive condition. To be using a substance to relieve distress against all the evidence that it's harming you is a shame-filled place. And shame is a really big blocker to recovery. It underpins that painful negative cycle. It's experienced in the body as a threat and continues to keep us out of that window. Shame is caused in relationships. But the good news is it's also healed in relationships, healthy relationships. The garden, all of the time. It was what Adam felt when God sought him in the garden to repair their relationship. And sadly, shame is endemic in our society today. We can just go into COVID with the race, with all the media that comes on every night almost. It goes hand in hand with addiction because of its relationship with distress and being outside of that window. It's why specialised addiction care is so important. Addiction specialists understand the difference between relapse and denial, which reduces the shame and maintains the connection. They can differentiate the two and continually offer that unconditional connection. When this connection is sustained, shame is overcome by healthy relationships, the windows stay wide or open or available, and therefore relapse is avoided. Face-to-face interactions with other regulated people, that is other people in their window of tolerance, builds another's capacity for distress and reduces their shame. These safe interactions widen that window. The Overcomers Place is a treatment program for all addictions. I want to introduce you to you now. This will be a real tech challenge, Mandy, to see whether we can get the video to go. The Overcomers Place is a non-residential program that treats all addictions and incorporates all the resources that I've talked about, not just this evening, but the things that I practice in my life. And it's now accessible in Gladesville, right opposite Christchurch, which is so exciting. Now, this little clip will go for a minute, and then we're going to come back and finish up and have some Q&A. Mandy's muted.
See if I can make this work.
Yeah, this will be miraculous. We've got a big God.
think we did it.
We did it. Have we got the ants one up? That last one on the ants?
Yep.
The overcomer's place creates this living bridge that provides the care and builds the connections back to our community for those overcoming addiction. Overcoming is hard for many without support. We know a God who can overcome all things, and I'm hoping you will join with me tonight in helping others overcome. So thank you all for listening to me, and I can't wait to hear some of your questions. Thank you to Mandy.
Excellent. Well, what we're going to do, we've got a couple of questions here, but what I wanted to do first is I'm going to put us back into those breakout rooms, and I want you to re-ask those first 4 questions that we asked in the beginning and see if your answers have changed. So I'm going to open all those rooms now. I know that that's not a lot of time in those small groups, but we thought that the question time would be part of where it was at. We have had a few questions come in on the public chat, also a few questions come in privately. If you do have more questions, feel free to use the chat function. You can private message that chat to me, the question to me, and then I can put it to Penny. But we've got a few to start with, and if maybe your question isn't answered, then you might like to ask another one. So we're going to start with the first question, was talking about the window of tolerance that we spent a fair bit of time talking about. And the question was asked is, can you actually widen your window of tolerance? Penny?
The way you widen it is on the edge. When you're just about to get out of the car and rip into that fellow that bumped you, and you sit back in your seat and make that decision to take a breath, get your feet back on the ground, you stay in the window, and the more you do that, the more you build that window. The plasticity is on those edges, that choice point. But they call the middle zone, the comfort zone, they call those edges the courage zone, because it takes enormous courage to go against your biology.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. So it's kind of that gradual extension, but it's at the edges that you've got to do that.
Where you get those choices. And to practice on little things that aren't so stressful is the place. And I think that's where Lynn said, when you're practicing building up that 3-legged triangle, let's say you had 4 and you lose one, well, you've got 3. That stuff builds your windows.
Excellent. Another question came in that was thinking about the whole idea of, we've talked a lot about having a flexible mindset and how that's helpful. Is there any evidence that a flexible mindset is actually more helpful for overcoming addiction than a fixed mindset?
That was a really interesting question, that one. I don't think in terms of flexible or fixed. I think the evidence shows that if you're in your window of tolerance, you've got the capacity to be flexible, which is why I love my little jug and my jug and my cup. See, this is flexible. It's got a flexibility around the mouth. There's plenty of space around that stress to make decisions. Whereas when you're outside your window, there is a rigidity. There is a speeding up. There is a hyper alertness, which causes you to make quick, no, it must be this way, no, it must be that way, sort of controlled, rigid, structured decisions and plans. So yeah, if you want to have a chat with me, by all means, give me a ring and we can talk about where that questions come from for you, and I can point you in the direction of where to go, perhaps.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. That's helpful to kind of think of how to look at that. There's another question that's coming.
You've certainly got more flexibility in the window than you've got outside it, that's for sure. Because when you're outside that window, your automatic nervous system's driving the bus.
Yeah. So questions come in about sort of the whole idea of the roller coaster that is being addicted to something and then walking alongside someone with addiction. And so you've got people who make the decision to deal with their addiction, but that's often only the first step of a roller coaster for them and for the people that are trying to support them due to the tendency to relapse. Have you dealt with that, and what do we do?
Yeah, this is 100% what I deal with day in, day out. It is a roller coaster. And as they say on the aeroplane, back in the days when we used to fly, put your oxygen mask on first. So you've got to make sure that you're in your window. And there's nothing, you ask my husband, there's nothing like an addict to take you out of your own window. But the minute you're out of your window, it becomes so contagious for the addict, and their wiring that's already in that space will perpetuate. It's like when there's a bunch of zebras in a herd and one runs, they all run. And so, the nervous system gets really susceptible to that kind of stuff. And often this is what happens with the family and friends, is their distress is picked up in the addict long before anybody's conscious of it. And so they're already using. It's why in July at the Overcomers Place, we will actually start a support group for family and friends, because the research has shown that if we support the family and friends to stay in their window of tolerance, and that your family and friend usually has more capacity because they're not using substances, that it will help the other come in, or at least once they make that decision to change, it will help them stay on that path. Of course, a decision is not action. So I often say when I'm talking to the addict who's made that decision, 3 frogs sit on a log to jump, how many frogs on the log? And they'll all go, none. I go, hang on a minute, a decision is not action. They've only made a decision. And I've got a little plaque in my office with 3 frogs on a log, because I never remember what I'm saying when they're out of the window, but they'll remember those frogs.
Yeah. We've got another couple of questions that have come in that I think build on that. So one is how do you initiate a conversation with a friend that you think may be struggling with addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's difficult. Philip Jensen, my dear friend, was the first one that initiated that conversation with me, and he will say in 60 years of ministry, that was one of the hardest conversations he ever had. Now, I don't know if that's because of me or him, but it was a very gutsy conversation. People before him had had the conversation with me, and I just did. But of course, Philip had a fair bit of authority, and he had authority over me, and, I kind of had to pay attention. It's a bit like the first thing to remember is you've got to stay in your window. If you're outside of your window, all you're going to do is perpetuate them outside of their window. They can't learn and listen. Remember that lovely rainbow space? You want to be where you can learn and listen. So being quiet, being regulated, being compassionate, being curious, and offering a perspective from your view. You're powerless over their response. You're powerless over getting them to see what you see. And often one of the reasons why these conversations are so frustrating is because it's a bit like you've got eyesight and the other person is blind. And so you're talking to them from your perspective of someone with eyesight. But this poor addict remembers down on the boxing ring with that monster going, oh no, I'm sure I've got him beaten, I'm fine. And what I've found over 15 years of working with addicts, there's lots of things we can do. We can chisel away. But at the end of the day, it is a moment of grace where an addict realises that their end of that line's got to come, that they're actually in a funnel and they've got to surrender to let somebody else help them get out.
Yeah. And
it's spiritual surgery in many ways. In many ways, it's like coming to know Christ. How many times have we sat with someone, read the Bible, I can remember when I wanted my husband to be converted after me. The first night I came home and said, that passage where you're lying in bed and it's like he's coming to take me and not you. I'm the practicing addict. So he kind of goes, what is she on now? And of course I later read the passages, or, lovely people like Mandy pointed out to me that, when you're married to an unbelieving husband, it's about your behaviour. So, of course, I had to look at some of my drunken behaviours and go, whoa, maybe there's an area here we can change. So there were lots of little steps like that along my way that brought me to that place of change. And then there was that moment of change where I decided I really was powerless over my behaviour and I needed help. And I was able to then put the action in that other people suggested, and I got sober. But with Andrew, it was interesting because I remember hearing Dick Dowsett at KCC on Romans 6, 7, 8. We walked down the hill at Katoomba and I'm like, oh, come on. You can't tell me you don't believe after that. Come on, how clear can you get the gospel explained, right? And he just went, bully me into this, all right? I've got questions. And he had to go and get his questions answered. But ultimately one day he let, the Spirit of Christ breathe new life into him and he became converted. Yeah. And it's like this. Amazing grace. I was blind. I couldn't see. I drank on a Monday in such a dangerous way that I almost did incredible damage to some family members. I was in a car. I was way over the limit. It was an ugly story. On the Tuesday, I picked up a drink like nothing had happened the day before. I'd actually had a conversation with God on the Monday. I was asking for a sign and, I'd had this near miss car accident. I was kind of like, there's your sign. I was like, oh no, I think I'd rather, something else. This is not fair. Give me another sign, all that stuff. The verse came back in my head that I'd heard 18 months before in a sermon. You have Moses and the prophets. Even if someone comes back from the dead, you won't believe. I had just done a Passover study. I knew what that passage meant. And yet the next day I picked up a drink like nothing had happened the day before. My preemptive brain had kicked in. I was out of my window of tolerance. But it was on that day, Tuesday, the 18th of March, 2003, that God said to me, well, let me see. I'm blind. I'm powerless. I'm actually powerless. I remember watching my arm going, what is wrong, arm? Like, where were you yesterday? Arm was out of the window. Arm didn't see what happened yesterday. That part of my consequential thinking is not online when I'm outside that window of tolerance. But God let me see into that window on that day. And the next day, miraculously, I didn't drink. I can't tell, I hadn't had a 24-hour sober day for years and years and years. And what have I done since? I've had to work really, really hard to get the resources to stay in my window ever since that day. That was the 19th of March, 2003. And one of the reasons why we opened the Overcomer's Place on the 19th of March, which is actually my sober birthday, is because some random lawyer said I needed to pick a day in March. I go, okay, God, this is not funny. We'll pick the 19th, all right?
Yeah. So, and I think as we hear part of your story, there's that helpfulness. A few of the questions have been there. How do we recognize addiction? How do we help and support people? And I guess part of what I'm hearing from you saying is that there is a sense where we can understand and we can see and observe, but we can't make somebody understand where they're at. It's the gently asking questions. It's making an observation. It's allowing them to have space, a safe space to actually admit that there's stuff going on, but that we can't actually beat it into them that they've got a problem that they need to have fixed.
Bringing curiosity and compassion creates safety. Judgment, shame, isolation, abandonment perpetuates the pain.
Yeah. It's been then a couple of questions asking sort of lots of people go through distressing things and seem to get outside of their windows, but don't resort to addictive behaviours. Do you have something to say on kind of like what percentage of people do suffer addiction and why is it that some become addicted and others don't?
Yeah, this is where the research is really interesting. Some people think it's about 10 or 15%. Some people think it's 3 to 5%. Some people think it's 50%. It's why I got that bell curve coming up, because I think, in terms of bell curves, sure, there might be 10% down that end and 10% down that end, but, where is everybody else in the middle? It's very difficult to tell. And why does someone become further down that bell curve and hit a red light and others sort of stay in the amber? Some are able to get back in the green. It's a combination of factors. There is a biological element to it in the sense of our genetics. They're not quite sure whether it's a nature or nurture because nobody's giving up their little babies as a test to see whether it becomes alcoholic.
Probably a good thing.
Probably a good, well, I don't know that you get it through an ethics committee at uni somehow, but anyway. And so what they have discovered looking at the genes, because they've done lots of twin studies and they've done lots of adopted studies. So where a child is born into an alcoholic family to two alcoholic parents, they've adopted that child out to non-drinking, non-alcoholic behaviour families, and the child still becomes alcoholic. So that stuff started to raise questions. And what they found was there's no one single gene, but there is a combination of genetic makeups that creates the vulnerability. And once that vulnerability is in that person's system, given sufficient stress, given the behavioural patterns, like I grew up in a family that had a drink before dinner, so I automatically thought you had a drink before dinner kind of thing, that stuff perpetuated all the other stuff. And that was, the pathway that led into me. It was a lovely, nice family, but they had this culture, and what went with the culture was connection. It was where I associated connection. And then in my social circles, everybody went out, they drank, And it's funny, being a sober person, you've got to be a sober person for a little while to really start to notice how big the drinking culture is out there, And one of my lovely children came home one Christmas and he said, Mum, one of the best things about this family is I can sit at a meal and I know I don't have to drink. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, fancy learning that in my family. But, it's because all his friends, all his social friends, all his social circles always had alcohol at every meal. And, this might not be something familiar to us in Christian circles, but, for me coming to church in my mid-30s, every mom I'd had a meal, I'd had a drink.
Yep. That's someone's just asked this question. I think it's a helpful one as we probably round out the questions. So regarding an alcoholic family history, is this something that we should be wary of around alcohol and addiction?
And I think this is one of the biggest things I've seen in Overcomers Outreach and in church is the rates of pornography are usually coming from those families. So in other words, within our Christian context, there's a really clear directive. No, we don't do, you're not going to be accepted if you turn up drunk or try and give a sermon while you're half tanked. But if you've done porn in the morning, you can still get in the pulpit. And so what happens is, forgive me for saying this, but sometimes I say to them, you know what, guys, you would have been better off drinking than doing porn because it operates on a different part of the brain that is so much more addictive, And they do sort of look at me just like that because they go, is she really mad? It's like, yep. But the thing about where sex goes is the same where food goes. It's much more closer to our that survival wiring. And that's where, the pathways in the brain are myelinated, so the speed that connections are made are quicker because we've got to outrun the tiger. That's what we're designed for.
Yeah, that's helpful. And then the last question that I'm going to end with, and it wasn't a planted question, but you'll be very happy with this one, Penny. There was a question about, can you let us know more details of the family groups and how the Overcomers Place works? And I really wanted to take this opportunity at the end of tonight because I think everyone would agree that it's been so helpful to hear from Penny to actually understand the whole the way our brains work and the way that actually operating within that window where we are comfortable is a helpful place, and that getting outside that leads to addictive behaviours to cope with things. And it's something that I know that I've observed that addiction is a huge issue around, and the fact that we have the Overcomers Place across the road from us at church at Gladesville is a great blessing. The work that Penny is doing is amazing, and the service that Penny offers at the Overcomers Place is free for those who come. But obviously, providing that service isn't free. So Penny, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the Overcomers Place works and how we could maybe support that?
Yes. Mandy, can you put that next slide up, the Q&A slide? Hopefully I won't lose my screen as it goes up. No, did I nearly? See, it just wants to try and lose my screen. So I've just got to go back. Where is it? Here it is. There it is. Just keep clicking the buttons, pen. So how can you help? Okay, so I miraculously, when I finished my training, I ended up on level 2 in the compassion counselling rooms at Gladesville at the invitation of another. And that allowed me to set up a private practice. And, you know, there I was poking along, and I'd see people who could afford to pay me nominal fee and see me for 50 minutes, and they were getting help. But there were lots of people I saw who were not only able, they didn't have enough functioning to come on a regular basis. And I'd seen this model in the UK that motivated me to do it, where, oh, that's right. So I started doing that, and then I got a job at a rehab, and I went to work in a hospital, and I could just see the devastation of this medical model where you get detox for 3 weeks, you get a bunch of scripts that, you know, supposedly help you get back in the window. Can I just say there is no drug pharmaceutical company that's going to get you back in the window. In fact, the research on mindfulness is it's much more effective. But just like we all go for the coffee rather than the 20-minute nap, we all go for the pharmaceutics for the symptoms, but it's not going to get to that underlying stuff. And so I knew to get to it, you needed time, you needed space of processing, and group is the best place to be. We all know what we're like at home, but when we go to family and church, we start to operate on a different basis because we've got all these people around us. So we want to know who we are in a group, and group is by far more powerful than one-on-one to help with addiction. And it also meant that if something happened to me, there's still the group there. It's not all about me. So I created this idea whereby you come into group every morning, and there's 2 groups in the day, morning and afternoon. And in the group, you process what happens, what comes up, what reactions, what triggers, what things took you out of the window, what do you need to get back in the window. You observe that stuff with other people. And there's 2 counsellors in every group that help you recognize, are you in or are you out? What was your impact of that, and connecting on other people? And it helps that brain wire up. Now, the way the brain wires up, like we learn anything, is repetitive practice, bit by bit by bit, over and over again. So, you know, counselling once a week's one thing, but seeing someone in the centre, originally we were going to do 5 days, but of course COVID's just blowing that whole plan up, but we'll worry about that next year when we're past COVID. And so this year what we've done is just open 1 day a week on Thursdays, and then we're going to eventually open up on Tuesdays. So I've got the counsellors working currently just for Thursdays. And I'm currently actively fundraising to pay those counsellors. I want to be able to pay a salary to one of them and get enough grants for the other one. And so I had this idea that if everybody gave up a coffee, 1 coffee a week. Now I have a decaf coffee with an extra shot and, you know, skim. So it's about a $6 coffee, you know, but I know you can get $2 ones at the servo. But anywhere, somewhere around that, just a small nominal amount from as many people as possible, we will be able to cover one salary. The goal was to have 250 supporters donate $250 a year or $25 a month. And that'll effectively cover one of the salaries. It's really important that I can offer this service to those that are struggling free of charge, because if an addict is out of their window and they've got $20, well, guess what? They're going to buy it on their substance, not on something like this, not on something that's good for them until they're built back up. So just missing your coffee once a week can be transformed into a life-giving gift. It can help the team at the Overcomers Place to be that living bridge for those in addiction to come back into God's care, His connection, and His community. That's our goal. So I've got so there's direct deposits can go in there, or you can go on the webpage and there's all sorts of little links. How will you find out about, and the other question was, how will you find out about the top? We're going to advertise it at Christchurch Gladesville, where I've actually got a little flyer I can send Mandy. So when because you've got everyone's email, haven't you, Mandy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you send the flyer out, I'll send out the thing. Of course, the trick is with COVID, we are limited in our space, which is, you know, starting to really annoy me. But that's not always going to be the case. But we'll start that supporters group in July. What that will mean is you'll come every Thursday afternoon from 1 to 2:30. You'll sit in a group. You'll be booked in, so there's an assessment process you go through to get in there. Just like our addicts go through an assessment process, they pay a one-off assessment fee to get all of that you know, basically someone's time and attention one-on-one. And then once they're in group, all services are free for as long as they can come. But if they don't turn up, well, you know, we've got their assessment fee and they've got to come back and do it again if they want to come in. So it shows their level of commitment to the work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Penny. And like, I'm really thankful that we've got something like that with such easy access for us to be able to help. And so I do encourage people, if they're able, to support what they're doing. I've just dropped into the chat the handout from Penny on the window of tolerance document. So that's a very helpful one that summarizes a lot of what Penny was talking about, and it's a helpful resource. So you can click on that link and then you'll download that PDF file that's there. And so that brings to an end this session of our Equipped to Care. The next one coming up is on, just going to check the dates so that I get it right. It's Monday the 10th of August. Keith Condy will be back with us and we'll be looking at Mental Health 101 and understanding the different mental health issues, a Christian perspective on it, and some common mental health disorders. So who knows, August 10th, we may actually be able to have that one in person and also offer a live stream option for those who aren't yet ready to come in. It's very exciting that we can say things like that now. The extrovert in me is hanging out for real people. But it'll be great to continue that whole series, and keep thinking about how we can be better equipped as Christians to understand different issues that are going on, to understand them for ourselves and apply them to ourselves, but also to think about how we can be loving and caring for others. So thank you all for giving up your Monday night. I hope that you've been as helped and encouraged as I have. Penny, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and helping us to understand better. And I look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Mandy, one last thing. If you Google window of tolerance, you'll get lots of stuff that comes up. It's what makes me different is that I apply it to addiction, but there's lots of material out there. I've sent Mandy the supporters group, and thank you all for the opportunity. Thank you.